Home Improvement. It was on the air from 1991 to 1999. It was a wildly successful sitcom on ABC's TGIF block, and I remember it quite fondly, although if it wasn't through reruns and syndication, that's primarily where my memories of Home Improvement come from. But why the heck did it work? What made it successful? What drew people to it? Well, I originally did a take of this video that I thought was fairly good, but then I spoke with my mother and asked her what she remembered about the show, and she pointed out some very good qualities, which I'll get into in a minute. But first, I'm going to front load this thing with some of the reasons why I think it worked, and then I'll go into what I was reminded of by my mother. So, one of the primary reasons I think this works is because Tim Allen was just a good comedian. It was based largely on his stand-up, and he was able to incorporate a lot of his stand-up gags into the show. And it was very seamless the way that ended up working. Ultimately, though, I think that Home Improvement as it exists... Actually, do I have this on loop? I do now. Okay. But ultimately, I think that the combination of Tim Allen's stand-up... I almost said stim. The combination of Tim Allen's stand-up and the acting of Patricia Richardson as Jill and the three boys whose names escape me, the one, Jonathan Taylor Thomas, I do remember, but the other two's names escape me. You believed that these were a real family, okay? You bought their dynamic. No matter what went on, the fact that he was this big TV guy didn't really affect them all that much. It didn't make a huge difference. They didn't have paparazzi everywhere. They didn't. Every once in a while, somebody would be like, "Hey, Tool Man," when it came to Tim, but it didn't really affect them. They were still small town Americans, or Detroit suburb Americans. It was believable. There were believable dynamics. You believe Tim Allen as Tim the Toolman Taylor. You believe Patricia Richardson as Jill Taylor. You believed all the boys. You believed the neighbor Wilson, which we'll get back into in a minute because he's one of the pivotal things in this series, and I'll get into that. But you believe the guy who played Al as Al. I'm fuzzy on a lot of these names. If any of them are watching, you'll have to forgive me. But you believed all of these characters, and it made for compelling TV, and it made for compelling situations. It was wall-to-wall funny, but it also knew how to interweave serious situations in between the comedy. And that really had an impact on people. It really affected people. To the point where when the show went off the air, people were emotionally invested, and it was a very emotional thing for people. I don't remember seeing the final episode when it aired, but I do remember most of the episodes in syndication when it started to wind down towards the end. You felt like the family was moving on from everybody. You felt like they were going away, and it felt like you were losing a relative to some people. It was very emotional. But so was the show. It dealt with a lot of emotional issues. It dealt with loss. It dealt with bad behavior. It dealt with, not always telling the truth. And it dealt with various different situations. But ultimately, you could relate to what was happening. It wasn't written by people who were just in a Hollywood bubble, who didn't understand life outside of Hollywood. It was partially written by Tim, who was not a Hollywood person. He was a stand-up comedian, and he was relatable. He was absolutely relatable. And the boys played absolutely relatable boys. They got into all sorts of situations that boys of the time and today would get into. You know, you bought all of it. It all made sense. And the dynamic was uniquely the Taylors. There's a lot of sitcom dynamics in between. There's the dynamic on Full House, the dynamic on Family Matters, but all of them felt uniquely like their own families. They didn't all feel like the same family. They all felt unique. Jill was a different mom than Harriet on Family Matters. Tim was a different dad than what was Bob Saget's character's name? Danny Tanner. They were different fathers. You didn't look at this and say, oh, this is a clone of this or this is a clone of that. No, all of these families felt unique. I think Tim and Jill were the best TV couple that I'd ever seen, and I still have ever seen. You believe that they loved each other and were dedicated to raising those boys, and they were a handful, but you saw how they dealt with it. And you believed it for the most part. It just made sense. So the other half of why I think it worked was the dynamic with Wilson. Now, for those who haven't watched the show, spoiler alert, Wilson is a neighbor character that acts as a wise old sage that they would go to whenever things didn't go right and they needed somebody to vent to. He would just be over the fence. His face would always be obscured. That was part of the gag. But he often had genuine wisdom. Sometimes it was a lot of foreign philosophies, and sometimes he was engaged in a little mysticism here and there. But ultimately, his wisdom was very down to earth and very good, and it looked at the human side of things. And they were humble enough to be able to go to Wilson and say, look, I screwed up. What can I do? And he was humble enough to be able to say, well, Tim, well, Jill, well, insert boy's name here. They just worked. And ultimately they found solutions. They valued his input, and he was a valuable member of that. He was an extended member of that family in a way, but he was a very valuable member. And it harkened back to a time when people trusted their neighbors. And all of this is stuff that came from my mother's point of view, by the way, and I fully agree with it. It harkened back to a time where you built community. You had community with your neighbors. You had community with the people who were next to you. You know, you could go to them for things, and they showed love and compassion, gave advice where they could, you know, where you would allow them to. You could be transparent with them. Nowadays, most people don't know their neighbors. Or, you know, in some situations, like the situation that we're in, we do know our neighbors, and we're very blessed to. A lot of them are very great people. A lot of them we just don't know because it's a big neighborhood. But back then, you know, when you had a neighbor over the fence, you tried to get to know them, at least if they would let you. And Wilson's a great example of a pivotal neighbor, of a neighbor who's building community. Like you see in the show, he came to events. You know, we saw him always. The gag was his face was always partially obscured by whatever he was doing. But you saw him. He was a real guy, despite that. It was just a funny gag for the show. But you bought it. You know, the character of Al being Tim's co-host, despite the fact that he was often bumbling around, you know, he was the straight guy to Tim's shenanigans on Tool Time, the show within the show, which is another element that really worked. You know, you believed that that show was in a show. You could still buy Binford Tools T-shirts, from what I know. I think they still make them. They're pretty cool. I need to get one. But all of these elements came together to create something that had heart, that had comedy, that had good acting. It felt like an old-fashioned stage production, but it felt like the best one possible. You know, the sets were believable. The settings, you believe that they were actually in a hardware store or on a TV show stage or in a house. You bought it because there was so much love and effort put into it. The acting was tremendous. You know, you bought that, again, you bought that Tim and Jill were a couple. You bought that their sons were their sons. You know, they had great guest appearances by a whole, you know, smorgasbord of guests. It was great. It was one of the last breaths of Americana as we knew it traditionally. You know, 1999, that was the year of the end of the 20th century, and one of the best decades of the 20th century, where there had been a lot of strife and war and conflict. And this decade, along with the 80s, were both considered good because entertainment-wise, they had a lot of heart. They had a lot of character. They had a lot of moral. And you really don't get that anymore. You just get gimmicks and all sorts of just wacky, nonsensical, non-believable stuff that's dated to the time and era it's in. But this stuff doesn't feel dated. Home Improvement does not feel dated. It feels timeless. It feels like we can share this generation after generation, and we're going to. It's not a fully, you know, it's not a fully G-rated thing, but it's PG, sometimes bordering on 13, but it's mostly acceptable for families, and you can tell there was an effort to make it that way. You don't see that effort anymore. I've talked about how ABC is a shell of its former self, and it couldn't be more apparent with the lack of shows like Home Improvement. You know, they tried with Last Man Standing, and they just kind of gave up on it. It's really, really sad. But Home Improvement is one of the greatest sitcoms of all time. It'll stand the test of time even long after its run. It still is. I believe it's on Laugh TV. It stands the test of time 100%. And there's so many fond memories of watching it as a kid for me, and you know, just seeing the wackiness, seeing the way that situations were dealt with, seeing the character development. It had good character development, even though it wasn't the primary focal point of the show. You know, it was very formulaic, but it didn't say boring with its formula. It had a good working formula. A lot of shows that would try to mimic it might not work, but it had all the magic together that really came together to make you want to watch this show, tune in week after week. And the promos are amazing. They really were. So, I mean, you believed what you were seeing on screen. I think that's what it ultimately came down to, was you believed these characters, you believed these scenarios, and you wanted to tune in, and that's something very special it had. Other sitcoms that I've talked about or will talk about, they have that too, but it's a strength of Home Improvements that I think sets it above the rest in many ways. Not that the others aren't good, but it's something that absolutely makes it stand out. And I don't know. You'll have to let me know what your thoughts are. What your memories are of Home Improvement. What your memories are of how it used to be, why it worked for you personally, the elements that you took away from it, certain episodes that you liked. You'll have to let me know all of that down in the comments. I'd be glad to have those discussions. Absolutely. It would be cool. But that's going to do it for me for now, folks. Thank you very much for watching. This has been Super Koopa with another Koopa Talks, and I will see you guys next time. God bless. Have a good one. Peace.